later, but right now, I don't want to say controversial, I don't want to say provocative, I want to say the Milton Friedman-esque, libertarian-leaning congressman from Houston, Texas, Congressman Ron Paul, also presidential candidate. Paul, welcome to the Jason Lewis Show. Hi.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you. I'm trying to find on economic issues things with which I disagree with you on, but I really can't. The fact of the matter is that I've heard people talk about you need to be socially liberal and economically conservative, but that's always been a fraud. You need to be economically libertarian and socially conservative, and I think you fit that bill fairly well. But obviously your niche in this campaign and why you've engendered some support, some very, very strong support by right now a minority of delegates anyway, has been the war in Iraq and its futility, according to you. Isn't that pretty much correct?
Yeah, well, that's been one thing. Of course, I've taken a real strict position on spending and deficits, and other Republicans have not been quite as firm on that issue. But you know, the war issue and the foreign policy is both a constitutional issue for me as well as an economic issue. So you can't separate the two from economics, because if you look back at the 60s, they claimed we could have a war and a massive increase in entitlements, and it gave us a disastrous economic decade in the 1970s. And I think that's what we're doing now. We're spending way too much on the war and too much domestically, and now we're having economic problems. Except in the 1960s, we were spending 49% of the budget on defense. We're about back up to 20% of the federal budget on defense. So if I'm looking for the crowding out factor, if I'm looking for the misallocation of resources in today's economy, it is certainly social spending and income transfer payments far more than defense, which one could make, a libertarian to boot, a legitimate case for, obviously. Well, somebody did a study recently, and he looked at those numbers a little bit differently, and he came up with a figure almost reaching $1 trillion that involves our foreign policy. You know, you have your DOD budget, and then you have that separate from the war budget, and then you have the foreign aid budget, and then you have the consequence of borrowing money and the interest you have to pay for our foreign policy. And he says it's going to go over $1 trillion next year. Again, those elements were all there. I mean, I love these people that think that the Department of Energy ought to be included in the defense budget. I mean, no, the Department of Energy is there to put out these ridiculous energy plans that says we shouldn't drill in Anwar, we shouldn't develop our own resources, we should create a food inflation by turning corn stalks into inefficient fuel. That's what the Department of Energy does. Well, and that's right, and I think we could agree on that. I wouldn't just as soon get rid of a department like that, as well as the Department of Education, and that would certainly help. And there's no doubt what you say about the entitlements. They are, you know, we're a runaway phase, and if you look at what the entitlement obligations are, you know, the next 10, 15, even 30 years, I mean, it's right. Unpayable. We just can't sustain it, so something has to give. But this president actually spent a little of his, what he had anyway, of his political capital after the 2004 election and tried to get what I thought was a doable, and I'll say the word, but somewhat privatization plan of Social Security, where we spend $1 trillion today to forestall a $10 trillion, $15 trillion obligation going forward, and allow people to keep what they would have withheld into their own accounts, that sort of thing. And it was the Republicans in Congress that torpedoed him. Well, it was pseudo-private because the government was still going to hold this. I could support this if it were a program to expand individual retirement accounts and truly let the people, you know, the individuals be in charge of it. But it wasn't exactly that. No, it wasn't. But it was much closer to allowing people to divert their own payroll tax to something that would come back to them in the form of a truer style pension, as opposed to letting the members of Congress right now spend the money and put the IOUs in a filing cabinet in Virginia someplace. Yep, that's for sure. And of course, there's if you look at my record, I never voted to spend one penny of the Social Security funds. If we'd cut spending elsewhere, the Social Security funds wouldn't have been used up, and that's what's caused the crisis. I guess my point or my support for what the president tried to do is you're not going to get, at least for now, until minds have been changed, much more so than today, somebody to run along and say, or come along and say, I think I'll just do away with Social Security. The best you can do is adopt a plan that at least has some sort of protection for my payroll tax instead of being spent, that I will have some sort of asset there. Yeah, but what he ran into is reality, and political reality is that people in Washington are for big government and bureaucracies and control and not return of these responsibilities to the individual. And that's, of course, something that I've been working hard on trying to reverse.
Well, yes, you have. But, I mean, as you well know, we already tap general fund revenues for Medicare. We will start to do that. The Social Security surplus runs out in 2017, 2018. Then we'll go to the IOUs, and we'll have to borrow or raise taxes. And then I think what's the figure where they're in the red, 2039 or something like that. But 2017 is the real date because that's when you've got to cash in the IOUs. So given that scenario, what do you propose?
Well, I don't think it's going to last that long. I think we're going to meet a crisis before that because if you have a recession, the revenues go down. There's a smaller group of people coming into the workforce. The elderly are living longer, and we're promising them more stuff. Whether it's medical care and prescription drugs, the whole works. No, I would cut spending over. I would work on this $1 trillion I don't like spending overseas, and I would let young people flat out get out of the program. And I would meet the obligations of the elderly who become dependent on government, but I don't think it's a good program.
Well, I mean,
you could work out a 10, 15, 20-year transition, but the odds of that happening aren't very good. What I'm saying is very favorable with the young people. So young people love it. They'd love to get out of it.
Well, I don't want to belabor the point, but one of the aspects of the president's proposal, as I understood it, was, and they never said this because it was unpopular, but if you opted out and you kept your payroll tax out of the trust fund, you actually got a smaller benefit down the road. And that is a way of opting out. Now, it might be opting out on, light, but it was still a way of opting out. And I want to get to the war and that money spent that you mentioned, but I also want to ask you some honest libertarian questions here. Are you ready?
Okay.
All right. A lot of people that are concerned about the country are anti-free trade and anti-illegal immigration, to be sure. I happen to be a liberal when it comes to free trade. I mean, in the truest sense of the word, going back before Roosevelt destroyed it. I happen to think that trade with other countries is a good thing, staves off war in some cases, but I happen to be hawkish on immigration. A lot of libertarians at the Cato Institute and elsewhere would say that's inconsistent. You can't be a good libertarian and be hawkish on immigration.
Well, I'm closer to what you just said because I want trade and I promote it. I will always vote for lower tariffs, but we get tricked into some words here that are misused because Cato and some others who are called libertarians support managed trade, the WTO and the NAFTA and the CAFTA. I don't call that free trade. I call that managed trade for special interests. So I oppose these super government organizations that will manage trade.
Congressman, you're appealing to a certain segment, many in the blue-collar community, with that sort of rhetoric. And I don't like these supranational treaties either, especially WTO. But the fact of the matter is your true position then is really libertarian. That is, don't get into any treaties, but just cut all tariffs. I mean, the real libertarian position on trade is it doesn't matter what tariffs they put up. We're going to have zero tariffs here. Well,
I want as low as tariffs as possible because they are taxes. But the WTO approach is literally a place where you go where you get to put on sanctions when you're complaining about competition.
Right,
so They don't really lower the tariffs. So I always want lower tariffs and free trade.
Well, no, but you want fair trade or free trade? Free trade. Do you want fair trade or free trade?
Well, I think truly free trade is fair trade. Fair trade sometimes means that you want to manage trade and put on tariffs. And fair trade people tend more often to be protectionists.
So if you could get out of the WTO, get out of NAFTA and all these supranational organizations that the multinationals want and all of that stuff, would you adopt a policy in America that says we're going to have zero tariffs or minimal tariffs, unless you're going to replace the income tax with it, but we're going to have zero tariffs. We don't care if Japan or China enacts a 50% tariff.
Well, economically, that is a good position to hold. If you got rid of your income tax and had a very, very small-sized government, and you were going to have a 5% import tax as a source of your revenue, then you might not be able to go to zero. But to argue zero tariffs for our benefit is a legitimate economic argument. because if others are subsidizing their exports, we get the benefit. This was, of course, Milton Friedman's argument that if they want to subsidize their export, take the gift. If they want to give us cars at half price, why not take them? You know,
you go back
I think the lowest tariffs if possible means that the lowest tax, and the free market always serves the consumer.
The petition of the candle makers, eh? Hold that thought. Congressman Ron Paul will join us for one more segment. We'll come back and talk about the war in Iraq.